Hello. Before we get started with the show, we wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying Always Take Notes, please do consider supporting us there. It helps us to keep the podcast going.
If you support us on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards, including a shout out on the show and a selection of successful magazine pitches.
If you pledge $10 a month, you get a free 2-month trial to Otter worth $26 alongside the other rewards. Otter offers automated transcription and live note-taking for in-person and virtual meetings. I found it to be a huge help when organising interview material. You also get access to a series of mini episodes with previous guests on the show, in which they answer 3 revealing questions.
The latest episode features Leif Arbuthnot, a journalist and novelist. Here's a snippet.
It seems to me that the thing that holds people back when they're writing long form is a sense of the abject failure of what they've composed. And I think that you've got to put a sort of tin hat on and just push through the sense of failure. A big failure was when my unpublished manuscript...
Hello, and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak with novelist and screenwriter William Boyd.
We spoke to William about starting out as a novelist while being an academic, about his parallel screenwriting career, and about the experience of writing a James Bond novel.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Will, to Always Take Notes. Thank you so much for your time. I wondered if we could start with when you were bitten by the writing bug. Am I right in thinking that as a teenager you were interested in becoming an artist?
Yes, I realized around about the age of 18 or so, as I was leaving school and contemplating my adult life, as most people do, that I wasn't cut out to do a proper job. This is what was worrying me, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. And so I thought, well, I'd better become an artist then. I must have seen some artists in movies or novelists in movies, because I come from a very, middle-class Scottish professional family. All my father was a doctor. His brothers were engineers and farmers and so on. So for me to veer off in this strange artistic direction I was an outlier, put it that way. And but I didn't know what to do. And so I thought, will I be a painter? Will I be a novelist? The painting route shut down very quickly. And so I was always good at Eng-Lit. And so I thought, well, I'll become a novelist. But then I had to discover how you became a novelist. And that took many years, or several years anyway. But I from that age, from about 18, 19, I thought I must try to see if I can live this kind of idealized hypothetical life of an artist writer.
Could you tell us about your first unpublished novel? So not your first novel that was published, but I understand that you had an unpublished novel that was about your year in France between school and university.
Yes, actually, I have 3 unpublished novels before my first published novel. So I had quite a long apprenticeship of learning how to write novels, because in those days there were no, creative writing courses, let alone a manual of how to become a novelist. So it was really on-the-job learning experience. And I wrote this novel while I was at university as an undergraduate in Scotland at Glasgow University, which was basically about what you might describe as a gap year before the gap years were invented. I'd been at a boarding school in Scotland for nearly 10 years, and I said to my father, I can't go straight to university. I have to have a year off. And he said, well, you can have a year off as long as you do something useful. So I went to the University of Nice to do a diploma course and had an academic year in Nice on the south of France, which was utterly fantastic, totally re-educated myself. And this was the subject of my first novel, which was called Is That All There Is? And it featured somebody, incredibly like me, doing all the things that I did in that extraordinary year I had in Nice, got it out of my system, slammed it into a bottom drawer, and it's never emerged. But it was useful because, if you haven't written something that's 300 pages long, it's a very interesting exercise to try and do it. And you realize how you run out of material, how your narrative flags, how, you're writing in a bad way, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a very important thing to do. And it explains why my first novel, A Good Man in Africa, published in 1981, 40 years ago, this month, was not like your classic first novel. because I'd already written that and, as it were, thrown it away.
Am I right in thinking that some of the getting it out of your system was in terms of writing about yourself as well? You didn't want to do more autobiographical stuff.
Yeah, I think maybe I realized quite early on that, I'm one of the many binary divisions that exist for novelists is that some are very autobiographical and some are manifestly not. And I'm in that last category. I really don't write about myself, and I don't write about my circle of friends or the things I've done. Of course, my life filters into my novels, but I'm not an autobiographical writer. And I think having got rid of my classic, Bildungsroman, first novel, and binned it, as it were, I then embarked on using my imagination and making things up, which is what I've been doing ever since. It's I'm that kind of a novelist. I think of an idea and then I research it and figure it out, and I use my imagination to produce the finished novel. I'm not thinking about what I am doing or what I have done or who I know or what their lives are like. I'm making it up. It's classic fiction.
Could you tell us about your beginnings of an academic career and why you took that path, and then how you sort of moved out of that? And I should say that I remember I did English at Oxford, and I remember my tutor, the David Bradshaw, sadly now departed, said that he, I think, overlapped with you when you were at Don there, and he said all of your students loved you. That was it wasn't clear whether this was in a romantic or a platonic sense, but he was he reported very highly on that. But tell us about doing a DPhil and going that way and then stepping out of that.
Well, it was a calculation. I mean, I had written this novel as an undergraduate in Scotland, and I went to Oxford to do a DPhil on Shelley, in fact. And I had in those days I had a grant for 3 years, and this was for me. This is when I was it was make or break. I was going to test the waters to see if I could become a novelist. But so my heart wasn't exactly in my PhD thesis. It was a means to an end. It was a safety net as well, because what if everything went wrong? What if I couldn't do it? I could always become an academic and teach English literature rather than write it. So, but actually, Oxford, I went there in 1975 and stayed there for 8 years. In fact, it was a good chunk of my life, and it was a very good time to be there. And it's the first time I met professional writers, and it was the first time I met contemporaries who wanted to be writers as well. I mean, at Oxford, when I was there, I met Iris Murdoch, I met Brian Aldiss, a science fiction writer. He was a neighbor of mine. Roald Dahl judged a short story competition that I entered and gave me second prize. And amongst my contemporaries were a lot of interesting writers who are now, very well known, like Alan Hollinghurst, Andrew Motion, a lot of poets interesting, Craig Raine, James Fenton, Jamie McKendrick. So I really, when I went to Oxford, I kind of found myself in a community of like-minded wannabe writers, and we swapped advice, we swapped experiences, and slowly but surely, while I was, writing this thesis on the poetry of Percy Bysshe Shelley, I was actually, trying my darndest to get published and get short stories published, and started a career as a literary journalist. I started reviewing books for little magazines and the TLS and so on, and finding out how you could live as a writer. That was the learning curve I was on, and it was fascinating, and it went pretty well. But I became a college lecturer. I lectured at Somerville and Univ, and eventually got a proper job at St Hilda's. I published my first novel in 1981. I stayed on at Oxford for another 2 or 3 years because I couldn't make enough money to live independently as a writer. And as soon as I could do that, as soon as my fortunes changed, I wrote a film. My first film was made in 1982. Then I thought, well, I can quit academia and launch myself as a full-time freelance writer. And I did, but Oxford was a good place to be for those 8 years as I, learned and found my feet. And you will know, Simon, there's this feeling when you're at Oxford that it's the center of the universe, which in fact is just a small provincial city with a university. But you have this feeling that the world is looking on at you. And I got an agent, and slowly but surely began to make my way as a young writer and have things published, and bit by bit that my writing career came together. But so Oxford was very important, and it was a very good place to be, in my early mid-20s as I tried to find out how you could become a novelist and actually subsist as a novelist, because it's a vocation and a career, of course. And it's all very well publishing a novel, but if you can't pay the rent, you've still got a terrible problem. So it was a real education, and I had a community of friends and acquaintances who, for the first time, I could share my, concerns and ideas and plans and dreams.
At what stage did you get an agent? Because I came across the story of the genesis of A Good Man in Africa, where you'd sent off a short story collection and said that there was a novel in the works, and then they asked to see it and you had to produce it in 3 months. Did you have an agent at that point, or was that sort of afterwards?
No, it's funny. I one of the other unpublished novels I wrote at Oxford, in fact, was a very experimental novel about the Biafran War, the Nigerian Civil War, which I had lived through as a late teenager. I was in Nigeria in the late 60s, and when the war was underway, and it had a profound effect on me. And I wrote this novel called Against the Day, and by then I'd published a few short stories, and I had a kind of mentor figure in this wonderful man called Alan Ross, who had a magazine called London Magazine. And Alan was a poet and a cricket correspondent and a memoirist, and he knew everybody he'd known. He knew Graham Greene, he knew Evelyn Waugh, etc., etc. And Alan liked this novel I'd written, and he sent it to an agent who took me on, but she couldn't get it published. And after a year or so, we decided to call it a day. And so my first sort of success, if you like, was with this short story collection, which I sent on, into the slush pile of 2 publishing houses, Jonathan Cape and Hamish Hamilton. And I wrote a letter to the managing director of each one, saying, here's a collection of short stories. 9 of them have been published in various places. So I had kind of proved myself. I said, and by the way, I've written a novel featuring a character who appears in 2 of these short stories. There's a drunken, overweight British diplomat called Morgan Leafy. And the managing director of Jonathan Cape, who's Tom Mashler, who recently died, he denied this to his dying day, never replied to me. But the managing director of Hamish Hamilton, Christopher Sinclair Stevenson, who became my first editor, replied and said, we love the stories, but we'd actually like to publish the novel first. And that's when I told my lie. I said, having said I'd written it, I realized, and I made it. I said, oh, the manuscript's in a terrible state. I have to revise it and retype it. And I wrote A Good Man in Africa in a kind of white heat of, dynamism. And it was all there waiting to come out. And I delivered it to him I remember this vividly, in September of 1979. And he really liked it. But he said, I'm not going to publish it until January 1981. So I had a whole year and a bit to wait. I had a novel accepted, was going to come out. But for me, 1980 is one of those bad, black hole years. It seemed to take ages to pass by. Then A Good Man in Africa was published, and then 6 months later, my short story collection On the Yankee Station was published. So I had 2 books out in 1 year, which was amazing. And eventually I confessed to Christopher that I had lied to him and that the novel hadn't been written, and I'd written it at this incredible, high-speed, energetic burst. And he's forgiven me. And but it's true. That's exactly how it happened. But in those days, sort of dating myself, that you could publish short stories quite easily. There are lots of places where you could publish them. The BBC broadcasted 5 stories a week on a program called Morning Story, and actually a lot of publishers were publishing short story collections in the way they don't really today. So my calculation was that having published 9 short stories in various magazines and on the radio and so on, I had a better chance for my first book being a short story collection than a novel. But in fact, because everybody wants to publish a novel, not a short story collection, I had to do this kind of sleight of hand, fingers crossed behind my back, tale of having to revise the novel that I had written, but actually writing it from scratch in super fast time.
Before we spoke, I went back to my bookshelf. I was able to find My Good Man in Africa here, which I think is in 1982. And I've got a Yankee Station, which is an 85. I was interested in with A Good Man, in kind of the where the material came from, because I as I alluded to when we were emailing, I was a stringer for 2 years in Sierra Leone for Reuters and for The Economist, and it was kind of regarded as a set text by various people there, particularly diplomats and so forth. And how much of this was drawn from your experiences? How much is from the imagination? I've seen this 70-30 figure, but having said you're not an autobiographical writer, where did the material come from, and how did you go about synthesizing it?
Well, the setting is absolutely autobiographical in the sense that it is, if you know Ibadan, Western Nigeria, which is a city that I lived in, and my father worked as a doctor in the University of Ibadan. The setting is absolutely authentic, and in fact, my father, who died shortly before I wrote the novel, appears as Dr. Murray. It was kind of my homage to him. It's a sort of 2-dimensional portrait of him as a man. But so the setting and the mood, the ambience is absolutely something I knew inside out, because I, born and raised in West Africa. But the story is entirely imaginary, and all the other characters, the diplomats, Adekunle, the corrupt politician, etc., Friday, and so on, are all creatures of my imagination. And it's so that, in a way, that sets the pattern for all my subsequent novels, in the sense that the background is sometimes something I'm familiar with, but I do make it up. It's old-fashioned novel writing in a way, and there are a few. I remember my mother, when she read the novel, got slightly worried that some local figures might identify themselves, but nobody did, and the only person that's a portrait is this character of Dr. Murray. I mean, Morgan Leafy is again a figment of my imagination, and I invented him because my father, being the doctor, saw everybody in that university, and there were 40,000 people, who he looked after in a series of 6 clinics, and he had a strange friendship with a slightly louche, drunken lecturer in English, an Englishman, and the sort of person my father, being a rather strict, disapproving Scot, would not have hung out with at all. But I used to see them chatting and laughing away, and I thought, how come Dr. Boyd is enjoying the company of this rather dissolute figure? And I think that's where I got the idea of these 2 characters, kind of a moral rock and this very amoral, shifting, dubious character, and how the 2 of them encounter each other. But so many ideas spring from just the slightest kind of inspiration, but there's no sense in which Morgan Leafy is based on any living being. But of course, he comes alive in the novel, and his relationship with Dr. Murray is a kind of imaginary relationship of 2 totally different people having to kind of deal with each other. So it's it's not, I would say, 70% imagined, 30% the real place, but it's more Nigeria. I changed the names. I call the country Kinjanja and the town Nkong Samba. But anybody who knows West Africa, as you do, you'd recognize, you get an extra frisson from it.
I was wondering about the figure of 3 months for that book and 3 years, which is what you spend on books now. Was it that the research process was necessarily truncated for this book, or was it that it was a sort of, yeah, as you said, it was bursting to come out, so it kind of was an expedited process?
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, I look back at my younger self when I was living in Oxford in the early 80s, and I wish I could tap into those energies now. I mean, I was writing this DPhil thesis. I was writing stories and a novel. I was writing a TV column for the New Statesman, and writing reviews and teaching as well. I was teaching English literature to the undergraduates of St Hilda's College, and sometimes teaching English as a foreign language to foreign students who'd come to Oxford to learn to speak English. So I think when you're that age, I was in my late 20s, I had boundless energy, and while I was waiting for A Good Man in Africa to be published in 1980, I wrote a huge chunk of my second novel, An Ice Cream War, at the same time as doing all these other things. So An Ice Cream War, which was published in, I think, September 1982, had been delivered in January 1982. So I could write for 5 or 6 hours a day, and the wonderful thing about having that sort of Oxford life was I had masses of time to do my own writing, and there's no doubt I've slowed down. I can manage 2 to 3 hours a day now, but back then I could do a full 9 to 5 writing fiction, no problem. So I think it's just your own energies and your own enthusiasms that fire you up at that stage. And so by September 1982, I had published 2 novels and a book of short stories, and written a film, and done all this other stuff. So I look back at my younger self, and sort of kudos to you. It was an extraordinary kind of period, and everything was going well, and everything was working out for me after the years of neglect and trying. And I could just write away merrily. It was and well, not just churning out boilerplate. So it was. I think it's a reflection on my youth and my ambition, and the circumstances I found myself in.
Could we talk about your method and your routine as you do things now, and particularly the idea of plotting out novels in advance? So with every fiction writer we have on the show, we've asked them this idea as to whether the narrative exists on the wall in post-it notes or in whatever form before they start, or whether they dive in. And we've had completely different answers from people who take totally distinct approaches, from having everything planned to really just jumping in, this plotter versus plunger idea. How do you walk the line with that? I've seen in interviews that you do create a skeleton and then follow that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, chacun a sa méthode. It doesn't work for everybody, but the method I have, and I've employed it, since A Good Man in Africa, is to spend maybe twice as long figuring out, researching, pondering the novel, making notes, making rough schematic plans of the novel, buying books that will be helpful, maybe traveling if required. I often use photographs as a research tool. And this period, I mean, I borrowed the terms from Iris Murdoch, in fact. She came up with these. I think she wrote in the same way. She talked about there's a period of inspiration and then a period of composition. And that very much applies to me. And there's sort of 2 years of inspiration, 1 year of composition, roughly speaking, though I am speeding up a bit as I get older. and it works for me. It's not for everybody. I mean, I have a great friend who's an extremely well-known novelist who comes up with an incident and then spirals out, as it were, from that incident to create his novel. And there are other novelists who you just start and wait for the muse to descend on a daily basis. But I think that's highly risky, and I think that's how novels get abandoned. You know, the 40-page novel, the 100-page novel, again, bottom drawered somewhere. And so I have never abandoned a novel precisely because of my method. I have figured the whole thing out. I know I won't start writing it till I know exactly how it ends, almost to being able to write the last paragraph of the final page. And then I write with confidence, not particularly quickly, but with confidence, because I have the whole scheme of the novel written down in front of me. So if I'm, feeling not like writing in the middle of chapter 13, I can just look at the notes for chapter 13. I know exactly what I have to write, and I spur myself on. I'm not waiting to think what happens next. And so it isn't a method that works for every novelist, but it certainly works for me. That's how I plan screenplays. I plan short stories in the same way. I figure it out, get the ending right. That's my general piece of advice. I give it to all young writers, say, I've got this brilliant idea for a novel. And they tell me about it. And I say, well, how does it end? And they say, well, I haven't quite figured that out yet. And I say, well, don't start until you've figured it out. And you can work back from your ending. And a good ending will save a mediocre novel, and a bad ending will sink a good novel. So I think, it's that there's a certain amount of good advice to be taken from my method, but it's not for everyone. And people don't like to know exactly the destination of their journey when they set out, but I do.
In terms of those 2 years that you spend on research, what are you doing with that time? I read somewhere that you read novels that are written at the time that you're setting your book in.
Yes, I mean that's a very good research tip, actually, because the throwaway details in say a Georgian a novel set before the First World War will provide you, who's writing a new novel set before the First World War, with all sorts of inadvertent authentic details. I use street maps, I use photographs a lot. But in that period of invention, I also have my other life, which is as a screenwriter and writing films and writing television. So, half my brain is occupied with the research for the novel I'm going to write, and half my brain is occupied with these various film and TV projects or plays. I've started writing plays as well now. So I'm kind of multifaceted. I still write a lot of literary journalism and general journalism as well. So I think it's a very British tradition. You're a writer. So what do you do every day? You write something. Whether it's a novel or a review, or your journal, or a screenplay or a radio play or whatever. So I'm constantly busy, or I've made sure that I'm constantly busy. So while I'm researching and accumulating this library of books that will serve my novel, and thinking about the novel I'm going to write, I am also busy on other things as well. So there's no sense in which it's a kind of a single-minded endeavor. I compartmentalize a lot, and I do all these other things as well as plot my next novel. I mean, as we're talking here today, I am planning at the moment the novel I'm going to write next. I'll probably start it in July, I think, or June, July, and it'll be delivered in early next year. But I've got masses of other things going on, but I am compartmentalizing away furiously.
In terms of those contemporaneous sources, I think I read somewhere that you particularly talked about Frederick Manning for the First World War. Is that right? The Middle Parts of Fortune and so forth, as the one First World War novel that actually has swearing in. Could you tell us a bit about that?
I mean, it's very interesting because I wrote and directed a film, a sort of art house war movie called The Trench, which came out in 1999, and I'm sort of obsessed by the First World War, as many British people are. My grandfather survived Third Battle of Ypres. His brother, my great uncle, survived the Battle of the Somme and got a medal. So it's part of family legend in a way, I suppose. And I've always been very interested in the First World War. And of course, most people go to the poetry for their kind of to access what the experience was like. And the extraordinary thing about Frederick Manning's novel was that he wrote two versions. One is unexpurgated and the other is expurgated. And if you read the unexpurgated version, which you can now, I've written an introduction to it, in fact, it's published. It's the most, I think it's the best novel to come out of the First World War in English. And there are not many, but there are a few, but it's extraordinarily realistic and extraordinarily bleak. And the thing that Manning did was to record soldiers' speech as they spoke it. And the expression "swearing like troopers," doesn't come from nowhere. And he uses every four-letter word available. And so it kind of strips veils away about the First World War, the Tommy in the trenches, etc. And you realize they are like soldiers throughout time. They're bitter, they're miserable, they want to be warm and dry, and if they can get any tobacco or alcohol, so much the better. And it's a very, very true story of World War One, and it was a kind of inspiration for my film, which I also said to the actors, they were all unknown when I cast them. They're now all incredibly famous, but I said to them, if you want to swear, if you want to use a four-letter word, just do it, just stick it in. I didn't write it in the script, so they all swore like troopers throughout the film, but it's totally authentic because that's what it was like. And so without Manning's novel, and he was at the Battle of the Somme, we wouldn't be able, I think, to prove that British soldiers said fuck a lot, but they did, thanks to Frederick Manning. So it's a wonderful source text for the reality of trench warfare.
A message from our sponsor, Vitsu. Marta's story.
If only each shelf could talk, reflected Marta, a Vitsu customer since 2004. Her shelving system began modestly and has grown over the years. It travelled with her from London to Valencia and now Amsterdam. This is the 5th time Marta has bought from Vitsu. Every time, she speaks with her personal Vitsu planner, Robin, who reorganised her bookshelves to fit her Spanish walls and her Dutch house. He even sent her extra packaging to protect her shelves with each move. You might say that their relationship has become a friendship over the years. Marta knows she is valued and trusts the advice Robin gives.
If your shelves could talk, what would they say? Vitsu's 606 Universal Shelving System is a modular, adaptable kit of parts. It can form the perfect home for your books and even the desk from which to write one. Visit vitsu.com, vitsoe.com, or request a free brochure via email at vitsu.com by quoting ATN 606.
Vitsu, makers of long-living furniture by Dieter Rams.
In terms of working for the screen or writing for the screen, could you tell us a little bit about how your process differs for those two different mediums? I saw that you've described one as writing novels as swimming in the ocean and writing screenplays as swimming in the bath.
Exactly. Doing both is a revelation, because you realize that the novel is the most liberated, generous, free art form available. You can do absolutely anything. You can spend 500 pages writing about 10 minutes in somebody's life if you want. But you move to film, and I've banged on about this a lot. You move to film, you move to a totally different world. The two art forms are are, you know, very kind of spuriously related. They're both narratives, but that's just about where it ends, because film is photography. And that may sound very banal, but there's basically in any film, and I include television, you know, anything that's made with a camera is ruthlessly objective. Everything is seen through a lens, and you, the viewer, the audience, are on the outside looking on. And so subjectivity in film becomes incredibly difficult to achieve, and the tools you have at your disposal are very crude and very simple. Film is a much simpler art form than the novel, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's just that, you know, it just cannot do what the novel can do. It has its strengths, of course, but it's not remotely close to the freedoms that the novel offers, hence my sea and bath comparison. And so what you do when you move to the world, or what I do when I move to the world of film or television, is to take all that on board, to take the industrial necessities and industrial constraints on board, and try to write something that will work well as a film. That has no relationship to the book it's adapted from or the life story it's adapted from. How will this work best as a film? And once you, as it were, confine yourself within those parameters that the art form permits, then you may be able to produce something that works very well as a film. And I say to people, you know, I've adapted, you know, very famous novels, Evelyn Waugh, Mario Vargas Llosa, etc. And I say to people, please don't compare the film to the novel. Just say to yourself, did I enjoy this film? And if the answer is yes, then I've succeeded. The kind of version that the film was based on is in a way irrelevant. And I always quote Vladimir Nabokov at this instance, because Nabokov did not like Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of Lolita. And Nabokov wrote a script, Kubrick rejected it, Kubrick rewrote it. And Nabokov obviously didn't want it to be a flop, but when he came to assess it, he said, Stanley Kubrick's film is a vivacious variant of my novel. And that was faint praise that was meant to damn Kubrick's film. But actually, I think it's very true, because film should be a vivacious variant, not a sort of dogged reproduction. And that's what I always try to do. I try to play to the strengths of the medium, to allow film to function as best as it can. And I also feel that's why most scripts should be original scripts written for the medium rather than adaptations. But I would say 3 out of every 4 films are adaptations. A film feeds off texts, and in a way, to the detriment of film to a certain extent, because if you write an original script, as I did for my film, The Trench, nothing in it, in a way, fights against filmmaking and the strength of the medium.
It's a rule of the podcast that we always ask guests about money and how it relates to their writing lives. So, you know, be as candid or as guarded as you wish with this, but perhaps following from what you were saying about film, how does your income divide between the film work you do and the novels? And was that something that you deliberately pushed strategically, or was it just how it evolved?
No, I always wanted to write films, you know, and I was very lucky that very early on in my career, I wrote one of the very first films on 4 in 1982. And I always wanted it initially to have it as a kind of, you know, something that I loved and wanted to be part of. But it became apparent to me that actually writing films was a way of freeing me as a novelist, in the sense that I had another source of income, and I could subsidize my novel writing by my film writing, and vice versa. For almost all of my writing career, I never sold a novel in advance. I would write it and then sell it. And most novelists don't do that. Most novelists sell their novels or sell 3 novels in advance because it provides them with an income over 6 years or something like that. You get to these tranches of money arriving. But for some reason, I didn't want to do that. If I wanted to take 10 years to write a novel, I wanted to take those 10 years, but how would I live? And so that's why I had this kind of parallel career as a screenwriter, which is, pretty much, started, as I say, a year or so after my first novel was published. So I've always had that safety net and that source of income. And, I've written lots of films that haven't been made. And in the 1990s, I was going to Los Angeles 2 or 3 times a year. I had 3 films made in Hollywood, but there were other scripts I wrote which weren't made, but I was well remunerated, and so that allowed me the freedom to write my novels without selling them in advance, and that was, for me, that was the main reason for doing it. And my novels sell extremely well. They're translated into dozens of languages. So when I write a novel, it's sold many times over. And all my books are in print in the UK, US, France, Germany, Spain, etc. So there's a revenue stream, if you like, from my novel writing. And every time I write a new novel, I get paid in advance for it. But at the same time, as an individual, as somebody who has to pay the rent and live, I'm not entirely dependent on that income, because I have another source, which is my film writing. So it was a calculation, and but it was not a venal one. It was something I wanted to do, but actually it's panned out really well for my writing career. And I, often my contemporaries, my fellow novelists who only write novels, say to me, "How do I get into this screenwriting lark?" As if somehow it's a river of money that you can just tap into. And I say, well, just write a screenplay, for nothing. Write it on spec and see how you go. I write lots of screenplays on spec, and you can empower yourself as a screenwriter. So it's something I initially wanted to do, but then fairly swiftly saw how useful it was for me to, as it were, keep the show on the road. It's a problem. If it takes you 2 or 3 years to write a novel and you haven't sold it, how do you live? How do you exist? How do you pay your bills? And so you need another source of income. Other writers teach creative writing. Other writers write biographies. But I thought the best thing to do for me to enable me to live like this was to write films. But of course, I've been very lucky. I've had 20 films made from my screenplays, and the luck factor is, in a way, much more prevalent in the movie business than it is in the novel writing business, and I'm very aware of that. But I have many irons in the fire. I have lots of projects on the go. I have lots of setbacks, but then I have lots of successes as well. So it is a kind of career choice in a way. But I actually enjoy writing films. I enjoy the experience of collaboration, and many of my friends, I probably have more friends who are actors and film directors and producers than they are novelists. So it's very, very significant part of my life.
When you were writing screenplays and when you were starting out, how did you learn the craft? Was it just by doing it?
Yeah, I mean, again, you can do endless courses, but at the time, it was a kind of on-the-job learning experience. But what I did quite early on, films I really liked that were in my top 10 or my top 20, I would try to get the screenplay of that film, and I would sort of open this, put the VHS in the machine and watch the film, stop it, start it, see how the writing conformed to the image. And actually, it's not difficult if you're smart, to see how a script works. And I mean, I've directed a feature film, and I've never been to film school. How could I just rock up on day one of principal photography and say, put the camera there, and we'll start with a close shot and then dolly back to a a wide shot or whatever? You just learn the fairly elementary grammar of the art form and apply it. I mean, screenwriting is again a change of mental gears. It's not about good writing. It's usually very pithy. It's show not tell. All these simple injunctions apply, but it's not. It wasn't hard for me to learn how to do it. And the first screenplay I wrote was this Channel 4 film called Good and Bad at Games. And once you've done one, you kind of break the catch-22. And very quickly, I wrote another 2 or 3 films and was commissioned to write others. And you can learn, I think, very quickly how to do it. But the way I learned was watch a film you like with the screenplay on your lap and, use your brain.
I wanted to ask about Trio in a moment, but just what you said prompted another question, which is, I think it's in the New Confessions. Don't you have a line that the whole sort of vocabulary of cinema was worked out really, really early on? All of the shots, all of the sort of methodology was sort of sorted by the 20s or the 30s. Am I misremembering that?
You're absolutely right. I know. My people that often ask me, say, the fact you write lots of films and does that influence your novel writing? And I will say not at all, because this reason, because I think that the film is a simpler form of telling a story than a novel. But the fact is that all the devices, and this is I think what you're picking up, is all the devices that exist in cinema were present in the novel long before cinema was invented. I mean, slow motion, parallel action, cross-cutting, jump cuts, flashback, huge close-ups, etc. You find them in Madame Bovary, and so in a way, the traffic, if it exists, is from the novel to the film, because these are narrative devices that novelists had worked out for themselves long before the Lumiere brothers, cranked up their first camera. And so in a way, it's the thing for me, the thing that film does, better than the novel is mise en scène. It sets the scene effortlessly and brilliantly. It might take you a couple of pages of a novel, but you can, in 1 second of a film, you've got a location and its atmosphere and so on. But the narrative devices are, in a way, all novelistic devices. And you can find the same types of cinematic narration in novels of the 19th century. So it's it didn't really invent anything. It's photography. That's what makes it different. But in terms of narration, the novelists were there long beforehand.
I wondered if we could track back a little bit before we go to Trio and talk about Solo, your James Bond novel. I was particularly interested to see your interview with James Bond in The Guardian, and I wondered whether that was a method that you used while you were writing to sort of get into characters' heads.
Well, the thing about the Bond novel, which was a commission, it comes out of the blue. You're rung up one day saying, would you like to write a continuation novel? And I'd written 2 spy novels by this time, and I'd also written a lot about Ian Fleming, who sort of fascinates me as a certain type of Englishman and a certain type of writer. And maybe that's why the Fleming estate asked me to write the Bond novel. But I decided that my novel would be a portrait of James Bond. It's unusual in the Fleming canon because the point of view is totally restricted to Bond. You only see the world of Solo through his eyes. And I reread everything Fleming had written, all the novels, all the short stories, and took notes. And so in a way, my sort of pseudo interview with him was the product of my sort of complete immersion in Bond as a character. And everything in my novel, which seems odd and un-Bond-like, is actually sourced in Fleming and Fleming's novels. So, Bond was a very nervous flyer. Not many people know that, but Fleming refers to it. Bond was actually a functioning alcoholic when you start counting the number of drinks he has in a novel. Other things, Bond didn't like women who painted their fingernails because Fleming didn't like women who painted their fingers. So all this stuff that I gathered from my reading went into the novel. So in a way, in my novel, which is set in 1969, Bond is 45, middle-aged man. So I say to people, if you want to get to grips with this mythic literary character, ignore the movies, because they have nothing to do with, in a way, with Fleming's novels. Then Solo will give you a very good portrait of this individual, and so that it was a bit of a spoof, that Guardian interview, and I meet him on the King's Road in a cafe and things like that. But it's
an area which is sort of down on its luck at that point.
but Bond lived in Wellington Square, according to Ian Fleming. He lived in Chelsea in the 50s and the 60s, and Chelsea in that era was a very working class district with a few rich pockets, and so there's a lot of intriguing sociological stuff around Bond, and I think that's what I was trying to bring out in the novel, in a kind of subtext, and also in the various things I wrote about him afterwards.
Could we talk about Trio now, but maybe in the context of narrative storytelling and story and characters, and your kind of defense of that in the face of differing ideas about what literary fiction should be?
Well, I think, my great comparison is I'm a realistic novelist, and the great broad river of the realistic novel has been flowing since, Henry Fielding, and will flow on. And my comparison, which I think illuminates the situation very well, is in the world of art, between the tradition of figuration and abstraction or conceptual art. Of course, modern art has gone in its various directions, but the figuration is still the dominant tradition, and as I think the realistic novel is still the dominant tradition. I mean, if you look at the great British painters of the last 50 years, Lucian Freud, Francis Bacon, David Hockney, Frank Auerbach, et cetera, are all essentially figurative painters. Hockney is painting a series of landscapes at the moment, and Freud ended his career painting portraits, classical portraits. And so I think that nobody says, oh, in these days of ours, you can't possibly be a figurative painter. Of course you can. Just similarly, the novel has its various offshoots and experimental fringes and so on and so forth. But the broad tradition of the novel is a realistic one, because it is the best art form for portraying the human condition. It is, without doubt, in the way it's evolved and the way it's elaborated, it deals with human lives and individuals better than the theater, better than film, television. It's almost tailor-made to explain ourselves to each other. And the realistic novel, I think, has always done that and will always do it. And it will never go away in the same way that figuration will never go. People will still be painting still lives and portraits and landscapes long after, your video conceptual, module has disappeared from the the pantheon. So it's just a choice, and again, it's a wonderfully liberating art form. You can do anything with it. I've experimented with my fictions. My novel Sweet Caress has 73 photographs in it. My new novel that I'm planning now will have a few surprises. But essentially they are realistic, and I don't like fantasy. I don't like magic realism. I like my fiction that I read to be rooted in the lives of real people, and that's the kind of novel I will write. However much I might tweak the form, they're fundamentally about real people in real worlds, and but I don't need to apologize for it. And I think especially if you think of the comparison with the world of art, you think how ridiculous to say nobody can paint figuratively anymore. So it's the dominant tradition, and it does a brilliant job of explaining ourselves to each other. I have this other little if you want to know what makes people tick in a good way or a bad way, read a novel. People are mysterious, but in the world of art, in the world of fiction, that mysteriousness disappears, and you can access their inner lives and see what they're thinking and dreaming and fantasizing about, etc., etc. And so it's a wonderful tool, it's a wonderful portal to understand this strange adventure that we're all on.
Well, that seems a lovely note to end on. We've reached the end of our time, which has flown by. Thank you so much for your time, Will, and good luck with the next novel, which I look forward to the surprises.
October next year, with a bit of luck. So anyway, thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Simon. Very nice talking to you. Enjoyed it a lot.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with William Boyd. His latest novel, Trio, is published by Viking. Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your take on the interview with William?
I love talking to William. He was such a generous and open guest. I think I really enjoyed the fact that he balances the screenwriting and the novel writing, and he spoke so informatively about how those two processes differ and how they can inform each other. How about you? He's been a bit of an inspiration of yours for some time.
Yeah, he has. I had to sort of rein in my fanboy tendencies. I read A Good Man in Africa years ago when I worked in Africa, and I read a lot of the other books, I think as teenagers or when I was in my early 20s. So I was really excited to speak to him as well. But I think, clearly, my sense is he's just a real pro, right? Like how he balances his different professional commitments, like, as you say, the screenwriting and the novel writing, but also, just a very, very generous and gracious man. So a bit of a kind of inspiration of how to be, I think. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our graphic design is by James Edgar, and our score is by Jess Danheiser.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Always Take Notes, on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there as Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.